Mount Marpole sits over Emerald Pass between the President to the northeast and Mount Carnarvon to the south. Marpole was not on my agenda even as I left the Emerald Lake parking lot, headed for a third-class ascent of the lazy monikered CarMar Peak that sits between Marpole and Carnarvon. As I hiked above two waterfalls west of the Emerald Basin, I decided to give Marpole a try. I ascended scree, glacier, and cliffs up southeast slopes to the summit ridge, a short scramble up difficult terrain, and I was on the summit. The traverse to CarMar proved fairly complex, but eventually I also summited that peak and proceeded down very hardpack, unpleasant terrain to join my up track from earlier in the day. From there, I easily returned to the parking lot. I left the already busy Emerald Lake parking lot just before 0800 and set a quick pace around the lake, following folks sipping their Starbucks along the way. I was a bit jealous of their laissez-faire attitude, but I had adventures to seek and places to go. No time for me to lollygag at the lakeshore, taking in beautiful scenes of low-lying clouds over Walcott and Burgess Peak. Such is the heavy burden of a relentless peak beggar. Sigh. I almost missed a small sign and matching trail that sneaked off to my left, indicating Emerald Basin. Thanks to overnight rain, or heavy dew, the trail was soaked as I started ascending steeply along the Emerald River below. Not surprisingly for the area, the trail was very well maintained and traveled, and I quickly gained height as it led northwest into the basin. Low-lying clouds obscured some views, but as I approached the basin I could see soaring cliffs and hear waterfalls plunging down their sheer rock faces all around me. Dramatic scenes were also opening up behind, as I slowly started up even steeper terrain to the base of two waterfalls marking my lower route, and barely visible through the morning mists. The basin was much more scenic than I was expecting, and well worth a hike if you're ever in the area. As I suspected while planning this trip, the terrain was horribly foreshortened and a little unfriendly underfoot once I left the comforts of a good trail. Near the base of the falls, I still couldn't really see them through thick fog, I deviated to my left to ascend steep terrain up and around the cliffs they were running over. I started in a loose streambed which foretold of challenges ahead. The rubble here was disturbingly loose and jagged, rolling as I stepped on it and very sharp. There was none of the usual give that rocky scree has. It was rubble on concrete, definitely not the easiest terrain for quick and efficient travel. As I pondered things in a delightfully warm patch of sunlight in a tree island above the cliffs, I heard some rock fall nearby. This was odd since I wasn't on anything that steep. I whirled around and found myself face to face with a large billy goat. Wow! Even better, he was joined by two other billies and a mama baby pair. So cool. He was as surprised to see me as I was to see him and led his troop to higher ground while I slowly continued upward. At this point I did what I often do partway into a trip. I changed my plans. Originally I was planning to ascend Mount Marpole from CarMar Peak, and only if I felt like it, the route looked reasonable and the weather was holding up. Now I was rethinking that plan. As I ascended under CarMar, I decided that I wanted a little more challenge today. So far the trip had felt quite reasonable, and I had forgot that it was Friday the 13th. I had Devin Peterson's GPS track from his 2022 traverse, and decided that since his descent route was easy, his words, I could definitely ascend it. With renewed energy, I headed for some cliffs on the opposite side of the rubble plateau that I was ascending towards CarMar. At first I thought the route would bypass the cliffs, but nope, it went straight up, and so did I. On hindsight, there are easier ways from the first rubble plateau up to the second, but the cliffs were fairly straightforward and fun scrambling on firm and dry rock. I was delighted to be off rubble for a while. From the top of the lower cliffs, I found myself on another rubble plateau, headed up a very muddy stream towards a distant Emerald Pass. Devin had mentioned descending snow patches from his traverse, but I quickly realized that his snow was sitting atop a dying glacier. I was going to be ascending the glacier directly. Thankfully, there were enough rocks on the ice that I didn't need crampons or icers here. As I ascended the glacier to a line of cliffs above, I wondered where the route went. It was not obvious from my current vantage, but I trusted the GPS track and the fact that Devin had descended it blind. How bad could it be? Heh. As I suspected, the cliffs broke down wonderfully, and soon I was ascending a very steep dirt and scree couloir that broke right through all the difficult terrain. It was bloody steep. I grunted and swore my way up here until finally, 4.5 hours into my day, I broke onto the upper southwest ridge of Mount Marpole, with threatening clouds building to the north.
Holy moly.
Without a ton of time to think about it, I started up the narrowing ridge, bypassing where I could on climbers left. Of course, I knew that there was likely to be a crux near the summit. The thing about difficult is that you always wonder if you'll know when you're on it, and then when you are, you definitely know. This time was no different. Just under the summit, I ascended a disturbingly loose bit of exposed ridge to a smooth slab. I descended from the slab and poked around a bit and found what looked like an alternate path. I couldn't actually see most of the route, but it looked like a slab traverse led to a tight gully, which would break the crux and get me a bit higher, hopefully to the top. The slab traverse was like all such routes, much more exposed and tricky than it first looked. Tiny holes with plenty of loose rock detritus all over it and fairly severe exposure. If you slipped, there was no guarantee you'd stop. Made things trickier than I first expected. Thankfully, the gully was exactly what I was hoping for and went relatively quick and painless. Getting down was future Vern problem at this point.
Well, there you go. I made it up this thing. See if I can make it down.
Current Vern was happy to note that the summit was indeed attainable from my top-out point, and soon I was enjoying the panorama. Despite a tiny cairn, I did find an extremely old register in a rusted can just under the summit. It was soaking wet and almost illegible, so I took some photos for later deciphering. I didn't linger in the cold wind and decided it was time for Current and future Vern to merge and tackle that crux area before he started blathering and sobbing inconsolably and things got messier than either of us wanted to deal with. As usual, the descent wasn't as bad as I thought it might be. The crack went without issue since I could stem most of it on my butt. The slab exit traverse was a little tricky, I'm not going to lie. The second half was fine, a slip wouldn't kill you there. It was the first half that was the issue. I carefully tiptoed literally off this section and breathed a huge sigh of relief once it was done. Hard part over?
Okay, now I think if I step right here, oops. Yep. 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 Nice. Actually, not as bad as I expected. Nope. Which is good. Woo!
At this point, I decided that the traverse to CarMar Peak didn't look horrible, and even with the weather obviously collapsing, I might as well check it out. I set a turnaround time in case things got silly and pushed forward.
Yeah. I'll just go a little higher and then I'll traverse.
The first part of the ridge past my ascent gully was quick and relatively painless. Some exposure and plenty of loose rock, but nothing I couldn't handle. A huge gendarme and intermediate summit along the ridge was relatively easy to bypass on the left, east side, and then things got tricky. I remember Devon talking about fourth class terrain from CarMar to Marpole, but wasn't entirely clear where it was. Obviously the summit block was part of it, but it didn't take long before I realized that despite first impressions, the descent to a low point on CarMar's north ridge was not going to be very easy or straightforward. Bummer. For some reason, I was sure that I would find a route down the horribly loose, steep, and exposed terrain between a false summit and CarMar's north ridge. I didn't really use Devon's track because the terrain was way too complex. I wandered back and forth between the south ridge and west face, finding any route I could to take me lower. At one point, I only had to get my right foot another 18 inches lower and I'd be home free, and I just couldn't do it. The problem was that I had to lower myself on sketchy holds before almost letting go and trusting I wouldn't carry on down east-facing cliffs below. Dang it! So close. I tried 5 times and I just could not get that foot down. I'd have to find another way. As one does in these situations, I sighed deeply, climbed back up some sketchy terrain, and found another way. It was messy and impossible to describe, but eventually I managed to traverse to the south ridge on exposed west-facing ledges, and from there made it to the CarMar call. Phew! I was now pretty certain that I was done with tricky stuff, and slogged as quick as I could up the easy north ridge of CarMar to the summit.
CarMar. Worst named peak in the Rockies.
Clouds were racing towards me as I hurriedly snapped some dramatic photos of Mount Marpole and the Presidents before starting my descent towards Mount Carnarvon, looming ominously to the south. As I started down what first looked like scree, I realized with some despair that I was in for some pain ahead. The next hour or so crept by at a snail's pace as I carefully picked and prodded my way down the worst that Rocky's rubble can get. Steep, loose, and hard-packed slopes led all the way back to my ascent track. It was gross. There's no other way to describe it truthfully.
That is a lot further than it looks.
After descending mercifully soft earth through the tree island, I was back at the nasty crap all the way past the waterfalls and into the valley and Emerald Basin far below. Again, there was no way to make this section seem like fun. It's just not. Don't get me wrong. The landscape here is beautiful, and having completed a fairly complicated traverse with wild views, I was in a great mood overall. I just forgot how happy I was for a few hours of the descent, and so will you if you ever follow me up here. C'est la vie. The cost of entry can be hard. In this case, literally concrete hard. A few last looks back at the impossibly foreshortened terrain and wondering at the different colored rocks, cliffs, and even waterfalls, and I turned my back on the dramatically beautiful little corner of the Rockies and returned to civilization along the sparkling waters of Emerald Lake. This is one of those trips that sticks with you for a while. Despite being horribly loose and full of disgusting hard-packed terrain, there is so much beauty and visceral landscapes here that you can't help but want more. Emerald waters lead to wild rivers and cascading waterfalls from glaciers desperately clinging to dark cliffs impossibly high above the valley floor. Majestic mountain goats balance impossible rock faces as clouds race overhead and glaciers melt below. And despite the odds in appearance, a route opens up through this landscape in front of the determined scrambler, making his way slowly through the landscape to summits with wide-ranging panoramas in every direction. This is the sort of day that reminds me why I still love scrambling after 25 years of doing it. There aren't many of these days each year, but I'm very satisfied that I managed to experience this one, and on Friday the 13th besides.